Um, so, right, because if you remember last year or the year before, we read a Rashi somewhere else where it says, um, Ein ha'olam mekomo shel hakadosh baruch hu, hakadosh baruch hu mekomo shel olam. That's say the world or the universe is not the place of God. God is the place of the universe, right? So if we use the euphemism hamakom, like when you comfort somebody who's in mourning, hamakom yinachem echem, right? That so the omnipresent is a decent translation. But so Moses, so here, according to Rashi here, this he's not really giving, this is not geography. This is a list of all of the places where they angered God. So he doesn't mention the incident, he just alludes to them by mentioning the names out of respect for Israel. Okay, in other words, I don't know, but you might have a shorthand with somebody else. You don't have to remind them what happened. You just remind them where, right? Remember that time when we were in that restaurant in New York, and right, and they immediately know what you're talking about, right? Like I remember one time, I don't know, my father had an incident at a Friendly's restaurant in the Boston area, and he was banned from that restaurant for the rest of his life. And I wouldn't have to just say, I would just say, remember that incident at Friendly's, and that was enough, right? So according to Rashi, that's what he's doing. He's just reminding them of the places, but he's not actually like specifying the particular incidents that they did. But that is Moses. As we'll see, Rashi will do us the favor of breaking down exactly what those incidents are, right? But first, right, Asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael, right? Moses spoke to all of Israel. Okay, why all of Israel? Because if he had only rebuked some of them, Hayu ele shebashuk omrim, those who were in the marketplace, right? In other words, they're not necessarily literally in the marketplace. I don't know that they actually had a marketplace in the desert, right? But people might have had a reason for not being there, right? And they would think that the rebuke was not aimed at them, right? That it was only aimed at the ones who were actually there. So they might have said, you heard from Ben Amram, the son of Amram, Moses, and did not answer a single word regarding this and that. Had we been there, we would have answered him. Therefore, he assembled all of them and said to them, see, you are all here. If anyone has an answer, let him answer, right? In other words, nobody answered him. Why didn't anybody answer him? Because they had no defense, right? They had no defense. It's like, it's like pleading no contest, right? I'm not going to actually admit I'm guilty, but I'm not going to contest it either, because I really have no defense, right? So according to Rashi, Moses wants every Israelite there so that nobody could say, well, if we had been right. In other words, right, there's a difference between like being in court and not being in court, right? If you're not in court, what happens? You lose by default, right? But you could lose by default, and then you say, well, had I been there, I would have been able to defend myself and defend what I did, right? But here, Moses wants to preclude them claiming that they actually had a defense. They just never had the opportunity to present their defense. Okay, and now Rashi's going to break down all of these different places, right? Bamidbar, in the desert. Lo Bamidbar, Hayu Ele Ba'arvot Moab. They were not in the desert, but in the plains of Moab, right? I mean, now look, we know, right? Like in California and Arizona, there's the high desert, right? There, it's not impossible for something to be both a plain and a desert, right? But if you know the geography, that's not what's going on here, right? There's plains and there's desert. And I actually lived 2 years in exactly this area, although on the side of the border, not on the Jordanian side of the border. So I know the geography. I know the geography pretty well, right? So in the plain. So why is he saying Bamidbar in the desert? Right? It means that he rebuked them for their having angered him in the desert by saying, if only we had died by the hand of God, right? So he's going through like all of the different places where they had rebelled, right? So he's mentioning the desert to remind them of the sin that they had committed in the desert, right? And in the plain, he rebuked them regarding the plain, for they had sinned with the worship of Baal Peor at Shittim in the plains of Moab. Okay, opposite the Red Sea, right? He rebuked them regarding their rebellion at the Red Sea, right? I mean, we know all about this one, right? Because they came up to the desert, right? And the sea is in front of them, and the Egyptian army is behind them, and they say, right, Hamiblien Kfarim Bamidbar Bamitzrayim, right? I mean, is there like a grave shortage in Egypt that you had to bring us out here to die, right? I mean, and that, to me, that's like kind of the first example of that kind of sardonic Jewish wit. I mean, I almost hear like a Jackie Mason intonation. What? There's not enough graves in Egypt. You got to bring us out here to die in the desert, right? And so that's opposite the Red Sea. Okay. Any questions or comments so far? I mean, to me, I find it amazing that Rashi can get so much out of one verse that at first glance seems completely unremarkable, right? I mean, and then the question always, right, and we've discussed this in other contexts, right? Is this exegesis or eisegesis, right? In other words, right, exegesis is when you're explaining what the text really means, right? Eisegesis is when you're making the text say what you want it to say, right? And how do we know if something is exegesis or eisegesis? If I do it, it's exegesis, right? If somebody else does it, it's eisegesis, right? I mean, that's also somewhat sarcastic, but there's also a great deal of truth in that, right? Like we all come to the text with our preconceived notions either of what it means or what we want it to mean, right? Which is not necessarily the same thing as the original intent of the author. Okay, so between Paran and Tophel and Lavan. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan said, right, how can they be between Paran, Tophel, and Lavan? there's no place in the Torah called Tophel or called Lavan, right? So what is now again? What's interesting is that, and this is just another example, and I keep harping on this, but you cannot really be a literate Jew, certainly not a fully literate Jew, without a command of Hebrew, right? Because the minute you see the word Tophel, right? I mean, Barnaby, when you see the word Tophel, what pops into your mind?
Garbage.
Right. Garbage, or like Ikar and Tafel, right? When you talk about something Ikar and Tafel, I mean, colloquially, we might translate it as the wheat and the chaff, right? But there's like the important stuff, and the garbage, right? Or also like immorality, right? Like tiflut, right? So you see that word, right? And so you immediately make an association with the word tafel, right? And then Lavan means white, right? Now that's a more basic vocabulary word. Probably everybody here already knew that Lavan is white, right? So he rebuked them because of the foolish things they had said, taflu, about the manna, which was white, Lavan, right? Saying, our soul loathes this light bread, halechem nafshenu katza balechem haklokal hazeh, right? And because of what they had done in the desert of Paran through the spies, right? So again, he's reminding them, and the incident of the manna, I mean, that's kind of classic, right? I mean, you're in the desert, right? You're in the desert, you're being fed, you don't have to work for it, right? You don't have to work for it, and it just appears automatically, right? And at least according to according to the text of the Torah itself, it tasted like wafers in honey, right? And according to the Midrash, it tasted like whatever you wanted it to taste like, right? If you said, oh, I'm thinking steak today, right? Then the man would taste like steak, right? And if you're saying, oh, I'm thinking dumplings, it would taste like dumplings, or whatever you wanted it to taste like, right? But they found the manna to be boring, so they complained about it. Okay. And Hatzerot, the insurrection of Korach, which took place in Hatzerot, and also Miriam spoke slander against Moses at Hatzerot, right? So she was punished with leprosy until Moses uttered the shortest prayer in the Bible, right? Elna Rafana La, God please heal her, and then she was healed. But nevertheless, you spoke slander against God. And Dizahav rebuked them for the calf that they had made as a result of their abundance of gold, right? They took that gold. Now, of course, we've seen in other contexts, right, where Moses sort of hints, right, that God is at fault, or at least partially at fault for the sin of the golden calf as well. Why?
So, repeat your question.
What?
Repeat your question.
All right. Elsewhere, we have hints that Moses blames God as much as he blames the Israelite people for the golden calf, And why is that? How could we say that God is at fault? All right, let me sharpen the question. What was the golden calf made out of?
Gold and silver.
Gold.
Gold.
They got
Gold.
from
The,
the,
the things that the Egyptians gave them because I forget the story, but it's on the tip of my tongue. But there was something about I can't remember.
Right before the Exodus, right? God says, go to your Egyptian neighbors and ask to borrow silver and gold.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then take it with you when you leave.
Right.
Right. And if they didn't have the gold, they couldn't have built the golden calf. Right. They might have wanted to, but they couldn't.
Right.
Right. Why did they have the gold? Because God told them to get the gold. Right. I mean, what exactly is the usefulness of gold in the desert?
But what was the piece? What I'm struggling with is, I remember you're telling us the reason behind why they had to take these items.
All right, so Rabbi Sachs says that it's reparations.
Right.
Okay, and that hating other people is bad for your soul. Right. And so to protect the Israelites from hating the Egyptians, he provided these reparations. Okay. Now that's certainly not explicit in the Torah. It's Rabbi. I mean, I'm not saying it's Rabbi Sachs's original idea. I mean, I don't know how much of what he taught, was original with him versus, him being able to explicate the wisdom of the generations. But there is something to be said for that. I mean, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, but certainly reparations does go some way towards kind of healing the hurt and the anger, right? And his point that, God didn't want us to be full of hate for the Egyptians, right? Because we see what hate does to people, right? I mean, I read a fascinating book. I mean, I read it when I was a teenager, okay, called Passage to Ararat by Michael Arlen. And it's a book about the Armenians, right? And he contrasts negatively, and he's Armenian, the Armenians versus the Jews, that the Armenians have never been able to move on from the Armenian Holocaust, right? And he says that Jews have, and I don't know what it means to move on, right? But we've certainly rebuilt our communal life after the Holocaust. And Arlen said that the Armenians never did that because they were so sunk. Now part of that is why? Because the Turks to this day have never even admitted the Armenian Holocaust, right? And the Germans certainly admitted what they had done, sought to make reparations, et cetera, right? So that's part of it too. So I think that ties in kind of to Sachs's argument here. Okay. All right, so we spent 26 minutes on the first verse. Not bad. So now we'll move on to verse 3. It came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first of the month that Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that the Lord had commanded him regarding them. Okay. So, right, we know exactly the date of this speech, right? It's in year 40, the 11th month, the first of the month, right? So basically, if the wandering in the desert is going to last exactly 40 years, right? So this is 2 months short of the end of the desert period, right? And so the question that Rashi asks is, why is it so explicit about the date of this speech, right? And why was this the date, right? He rebuked them only a short while before his death, right? Because we know, right? Moses dies at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, right? He dies and he knows already that he's going to die, right? Because where are they? They're on the other side of the Jordan,
Looking into Canaan.
looking into the promised land, and he knows that he's not going with them, right? So I don't know that at this point he knows the exact date of his death, but he knows it's soon, right? He knows it's soon, and because his death is not far off, this is when he decided that he was gonna rebuke them. From Jacob, who rebuked his sons only a short while before his death, right? Which we're actually we're going to read that pretty soon, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to read that. I mean, we're going to start the Joseph saga, and at the end of the Joseph saga, we're going to have the deathbed scene where Jacob blesses his sons, but contained within that blessing is rebuke at times. So Jacob rebuked his sons only a short while before he died. Reuben, my son, I will tell you why I have not reproved you for your shortcomings during all these years, so that you would not leave me and join my brother Esau, right? That, in other words, I'm afraid that if I, tell you off for the bad things you did, right? You're gonna leave me and join up with Esau instead, right? Now, I'm not sure what I think about this, right? But that's what Rashi says. All right. And then he goes on to say there are 4 reasons one should not reprimand a person except shortly before one's death, so that one should not rebuke and again have to rebuke him, so as not to cause his friend to feel ashamed when he sees him, etc. Okay, so he says there are 4 reasons, but then he only gives 2. And then Joshua did the same, and so did Samuel, and David rebuked his son Solomon only shortly before his death. Right now, this whole thing leaves me a little confused and a little uneasy. Right? I mean, it's confusing because, most of us don't know when we're going to die, right? And I mean, it goes against what it says in Pirkei Avot, right, where you should repent the day before your death, right? And then it goes on to say, well, okay, repent the day before your death, but how do you know, right? How do you know when you're going to die? And then the Pirkei says, yeah, exactly, which is why you should repent every day, right? In other words, treat every day as if it's your last. But here, Rashi is saying, don't rebuke people until you're almost ready to die, right? And I mean, I get his reasoning, right? That you don't want to be constantly rebuking them, right? But on the other hand, I mean, what is the purpose of rebuke? What is the purpose of rebuke?
Well, to try and get someone to mend their ways and point out. And so this doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't make sense, right? I mean, it makes sense. Look, I mean, there is a lot of halachic and quasi-halachic material about rebuke, right? And you're not supposed to rebuke somebody if you have strong reason to believe that the rebuke will not be successful.
Okay.
Right? Because you're just compounding their sin, right? It's the same thing. I mean, I've spoken it before, the difference between a transgression that is committed b'shogeg and a transgression that is committed b'mezid, right? That is to say, you violated halacha, but you didn't know what the halacha was, right? Like I don't know, somebody, I don't know, somebody tells me that, every Shabbat after shul, they make themselves an omelet, right? And I conclude that they don't realize that cooking is forbidden on Shabbat, right? Do I tell them you're not supposed to do that? Why or why not? Right? And the answer is, and of course this requires, a certain amount of like being, the mighty Kreskin, right? And being able to see what people will do or not do, right? But if I have reason to believe, right, that the person legitimately doesn't know that it's not allowed to cook on Shabbat, right? And if I tell them they'll stop doing it, then I should tell them, right? But if my gut feeling is they really don't know, right? But if I tell them they're going to keep doing it anyway, right, then I shouldn't tell them, right? Because previously they were acting, right, in legitimate ignorance, right? Now they're acting in, knowing disregard of the law, right? And that's even worse, right? So, if you think that the rebuke is not going to be successful, right, then don't do it, all right? And so that, makes sense when he talks about Jacob not rebuking Reuben, right? Because the fear is if I rebuke him, he's not going to take it well. And in fact, he's going to run away, right? And he's going to sign up with Esau, my evil twin, right? Well, I don't want that. So I'll keep him near me. And then, when it's much, much later, I'll rebuke him. But beyond that, I don't really accept really accept what Rashi says here. Anybody else have some thoughts on this?
Well, I don't agree. I don't agree with it. I like you. I don't agree with it. It just doesn't. It doesn't. Sometimes you need to point out something, a correction. But then the example you gave about not knowing to cook on that you can not that cooking is forbidden on Shabbat. But it also, on the other hand, if you tell them that what they would continue to cook and continue and then really start not observing Shabbat, you could drive them away.
Right. Right. So it's not, I mean, it's not a simple matter, right? And it's one of the reasons why, why a rabbi has to know their congregants, right? And because I remember, and I've said this before, but many years ago, before the Haberman Institute was the Haberman Institute, and Rabbi Haberman was still alive, they had a scholar in residence day with Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, who he's probably retired now, but he was a professor of history at the Hebrew University. And Chaim Soloveitchik was the son of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And Chaim Soloveitchik had just published an article, very famous article called Rupture and Reconstruction, where he decried the movement to the right within Orthodox Judaism, right? How everything has become more stringent and more stringent and more stringent, right? So that, for example, you're not allowed to eat fish, right? I mean, many Orthodox rabbis now say you're not allowed to eat fish on Shabbat because fish has little bones in it, and you pull out the bones, and that is violating the malacha of borer. Okay, that is sifting out the chaff from the wheat, right? Whereas chicken is fine because you don't take the bones out of chicken, you take the meat off the bones, right? And that's separating the good from the bad, right? We spoke about ikar and tafel before, right? But when you take the bones out of the fish, you're separating out the bad from the good. Okay, and you can't do that on Shabbat. This ignores the fact that Jews have been eating fish on Shabbat for 3,500 years, right? But all of a sudden, we're so much frummer than the past 3,500 years. But anyway, so so after his lecture, a few of us were sitting around over drinks, actually, and he said, most Orthodox rabbis think that their job is to tell somebody the will of God in a specific situation. And that's wrong. It's to tell somebody the will of God for that specific person in that specific situation, right? So that it's not right that there is this model of halachic decision making that it's like a computer, right? Data goes in and psak comes out, right? But it's not that way. For example, but somebody could. I mean, it could. Somebody calls me up and says, I'm making beef stew for Shabbat, and I grabbed the spoon to stir it, right? And I realized that I grabbed the dairy spoon, right? And now I don't know what to do, right? Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, right, if this is if they call me at 3:30 tomorrow, right, and I tell them your beef stew is treif, then they have nothing to eat for Shabbat, right? Because Shabbat starts at like 3:45, right? If they call me at 3:30 in the afternoon in July, right, when Shabbat doesn't start till 7:30, right? And I know that they could afford to make something else and da 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 da. It might be a different answer, right? It's not necessarily so cut and dry. But you have to know the person that you're talking to. All right. So now we spent 42 minutes on 2 verses. No, that's good because we've cut it down to an average of 21 minutes instead of 26 minutes. So I only prepared 17 and we did 2, so that's not too bad. All right, so after he had smitten Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, king of the Bashan, who dwelt in Ashtaroth in Edrei. After he had smitten Sihon, Moses said, if I rebuke them before they enter at least part of the land, they will say, what claim has this man on us? What good has he ever done for us? He has only come to vex us and to find some pretext, for he does not have the power to bring us into the land. Therefore, he waited until he defeated Sihon and Og before them and given them possession of their land, and only afterwards did he rebuke them, right? In other words, even though this is not part of Eretz, I mean, it's on the other side of the Jordan, right? But this is land that they conquered where the 2.5 tribes, right, will remain. So it becomes part of the kingdom of Israel, right? But in other words, so Rashi's saying, Moses wanted to prove that he had done something for the people before he rebuked them. So, and that they shouldn't say, well, he's just saying that to cover up the fact that he can't really do anything for us, right? And this reminds me of the so-called first commandment of the 10 Commandments, right? Because, right, I mean, we've discussed this, right? That the first commandment is not a commandment, right? And every time I discuss this, people jump through all kinds of hoops and twist themselves to say, well, it's maybe not a commandment, but it's an implied commandment because no, it's not. It's right, Marcia, you're shaking your head. What is it?
Well, I agree. It's sort of like a preamble to the others, in a
Right,
sense.
it's a preamble, right? But
Yeah.
what is its role? Why is it necessary?
It's to remember the exact wording. It's necessary this is what God's commandments that He's accepted.
No, but I think it's more than that, right? Because it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, right? Asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim. But in other words, here's how I read it. I read it as it's establishing God's legitimacy to give commandments in the first place, right? I'm not just coming in and giving commandments. I did something for you, right? Now, the fact that it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, right? As opposed to, I am the Lord your God who created you, right? Means, unlike people who like to talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition, which doesn't exist, right? from the internal biblical perspective, the Ten Commandments are addressed to Israel.
Only.
Right? Only because if they were addressed to all humanity, right, it wouldn't say Asher Hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim.
Right.
Right? It would say Asher Baraticha. Right? I am the Lord your God who created you. Because everybody was created by God, but not everybody was brought out of Egypt. Right? But the role of a preamble is, in this case, is to establish, right, the legitimacy of God having the right to give commandments in the first place, right? And so that, according to Rashi, is exactly what's going on here, right? He's already begun the conquest, and therefore he has some legitimacy to rebuke the Israelites for their failings, right? That it's not just pretextual. Okay. All right. I am getting a little tired. I mean, I know it's still early, but I'm just going to do one more verse. You know, it's been a rough couple of weeks and it's now been a rough day, but I'm going to do one more verse. Okay. Chapter 1, verse 5. Be'ever HaYarden, on the other side of the Jordan, Be'eretz Moab, in the land of Moab, Ho'il Moshe be'er et ha-Torah hazot lemor. Moses commenced explaining this Torah saying. Okay, so the first comment is Ho'il. Right now here, I mean, unfortunately, the translator doesn't really help us to understand what Rashi's problem is, right? He just translated as commenced and then says that commenced means commenced, right? But the problem here is that Ho'il is an obscure word, right? That's what's the problem, right? I mean, you wouldn't necessarily know. So in the Hebrew, Rashi says Ho'il means hitchil, okay? He began, okay? So but this is an easy Rashi, right? He's simply explaining what a fairly obscure word means. But be'er et ha-Torah, he explained this law, okay? Be'er, like in rabbinic Hebrew, it's not, it means really to sort of make something clear, okay? Like a biur, I don't even know really how to say it in English, right? But it's not just explaining. Let's say it's explicating, it's expounding, right? It's really making something very, very clear, right? That might be obscure, okay? And Rashi says, B'shivim lashon pirsha lahem, okay? Now, again, I mean, you need a Rashi on the Rashi, right? Because the word lashon, right, it means language, but it also means tongue. But of course, tongue also means language, right? I mean, if you say, right, you know, my native tongue, right? I'm not talking about the thing that's in your mouth, right? But it also means like a way of explaining, right? So like I said, you need a Rashi on the Rashi, right? So the simple meaning of the Rashi is he explained it to them in 70 languages, right? Now, that's not satisfactory, right? Why isn't it not satisfactory? Because it's not necessary, right? They all speak Hebrew,
Yeah.
right? I mean, he doesn't need to explain it to them in 70 languages. It makes no sense, right? It's completely superfluous, right? So then you have this other commentary, Haktava HaKabbalah, explain this to mean that Moses gave them 70 interpretations to every passage, right? And there is this rabbinic statement, Shivim Panim LaTorah, right? That the Torah has 70 faces, right? And so, so like I could explain something one way, right? I mean, I could be giving a class and, somebody say, I explain blah, 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 and somebody says, I remember Rabbi Raphael said it differently. And I would say, Shivim Panim LaTorah, right? The Torah has 70 faces, right? That, and the tradition is multifaceted and multivalent, right? And this idea that, the more religious you are, the more narrow you want your interpretation to be, and you want to force everything into one place and one direction. That's so contrary to the actual tradition.
Yeah.
Right? The actual tradition says Shivim Panim LaTorah, right? That there are now Shivim Panim and not Ein Sof Panim, right? There are 70 faces, not infinite faces, right? In other words, there are limits to what you can call like a legitimate Jewish perspective, right? It's not infinite, but 70 is still a lot, right? And so, that's so that Moses is giving over the idea, like in explaining it, he's explaining the fact that the Torah is multifaceted and multivalent, and there are many legitimate ways to interpret and to understand. All right. Questions or comments?
I'm just amazed at how much is in these first five verses. It's just amazing. This is really interesting. You read
it's a lot. I mean, it's I'm glad I came up with the idea of doing the stuff that we read in the summer rather than. I mean, it's a little bit more work, but still, I think
it's more work. But there's so much in Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
And we haven't studied it, and some of it is not. It's not always easy to understand, to look at the interpretations, and so anyway, I really appreciate this. But this is really interesting.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Good night.
I just want to add something. It must be something about today. You mentioned your rabbinical friend. 5 o'clock this afternoon, I get a call from a friend of my sister's in Chicago to tell me that my sister's husband just passed away this morning. I knew nothing about it, and it wasn't sudden. It's a whole thing. From mid-afternoon almost to here has just been unbelievable.
Wow, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, well, strange day.
Yeah.
It's too much.
What?
It's too much.
I know.
Well, thank you for joining, especially under the circumstances.
Well, I needed it. It helped.
Good. I'm glad.
Okay.
Me too. Matter of fact.
Okay.
All right. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Mm.